This is a new game they're trying out at the Clacton Holiday Camp. Not exactly a game of skill, though you do play it on a marked board or sheet. But there are no pieces to play with. You have to use yourself. The arrow tells you where to put your hands and feet, and the idea is to overbalance your opponent. It sounds as complicated as the things that happen when you play it. They call it the twister, and the makers say it's guaranteed to tie you up in knots.
Today you've heard broadcasts from Bill Barry, Boom Boom Brannigan, Tom Coover, and yours truly, Roger Day. And I speak for myself, and I'm sure I speak for all of them. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having us in your home. Tomorrow morning at 5.
Welcome to Hadland and Newhouse Laboratories, a facility that specializes in the development of photography and film lenses. And by all accounts, it's a pretty swell place to work. And I guess that I'm not going out on a limb here by saying that everybody in the laboratory was on a first-name basis. Real cozy, like a bunch of homos in a hot tub. But I ain't here to judge, 'cause judging ain't my business. Based in a small, shitty, one-horse market town in England. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, but no one's business was worth knowing. But all wasn't well at the laboratories because a mystery illness had broken out. Some of the symptoms included headaches, nausea, shitting yourself, worse than that, liquid shit shooting right through your clothing. And by witness accounts, there were no warning. Someone would just say oops, and then shit would start shooting out like one of those water fountains in Vegas. And everybody in town was talking about it. They even gave it a name, the Bovington Bug. I would have called it something like the shit spray bug or the sprinkler shit spray bug. You know, something more catchy. But was it a bug? Because there was a lot of harsh industrial strength chemicals used in the development of their lenses, so it could have been a mixture of anything. But one thing was for sure, a lot of people were touching cloth. Floor manager Bob Eagle had got the shits, and he kept shitting till he could shit no more. Paralysis had spread through his body, and by all accounts, his demise was an excruciating one and messy. The close-knit company were affected by his death. He was a popular employee, and one of those employees was his young assistant, Graham Young, who was so distraught by the death he was asked to speak at the man's funeral. After all, he'd appeared to have lost what many thought were his second father, and by all accounts, it was a pretty good speech. Had everybody squeezing out a few tears, even the people who couldn't stand Bob. But then again, this wasn't the young man's first exposure to death and loss. When he was just 14 years old, his stepmother died right in front of him in the family's front yard, to what physicians felt it was a result of an accident she'd suffered a month earlier. She'd been hit by a bus and had a head injury, and I guess it finally won out. Her husband Fred had come home from the pub, and he saw her laying on the front walkway in agony, while Graham watched her from the kitchen window. I guess he was too shocked to do anything. Molly Young was rushed to the hospital that afternoon. They couldn't save her, and on Graham's advice, she was cremated quickly to spare Fred any more pain. Who the fuck takes advice on cremation from a 14-year-old? When I was 14, I was sniffing modeling glue. It was at the reception for the funeral that Fred's brother was eating a sandwich, and he got sick, started throwing up right there in front of everyone. But it seemed that the Young's house was cursed because that wasn't the first incidence of illness. Fred and both of the children, Graham and Winifred, had suffered from a mystery illness in recent months, with Fred at one point wondering if it was his son's chemistry set that had somehow tainted their food supplies or the cutlery, and he scolded Graham and told him to not do any of his science experiments in the kitchen. But unknown to Fred Young, Graham's best friend had recently suffered from the same stomach cramps and diarrhea. In fact, he'd lost feeling in his legs and had to be hospitalized. It was at one point his sister Winifred had passed out on the way to work on the train, and when she got the lab work back from the hospital, turns out she had a rare poison in her system called belladonna, a plant extract, and she blamed Graham and his fucking chemistry set. Her words, not mine, but he vehemently denied it. Both Graham and his sister were raised in a cold and unloving home, as their mother checked out early. The mother had died from pleurisy when Graham was only 4 years old, and by all accounts both the kids were devastated. The father left them at an aunt's for a while, before he got remarried and took them back.
His father, as far as I knew, had no time for him whatsoever. He never, well, what can I say, he never cherished him as he should do or anything like that.
It was in September of 1971, and things weren't improving in the factory, with what at times seemed that half the staff were ill. In fact, it got so bad that the Environmental Health Department were called in to do tests, but it all came up as clean as a sole on a cripple's boot. And yeah, sure, there were theories, like the chemicals that the laboratory used, rumors that the government were doing radioactive testing in a nearby abandoned airfield, but all those were just rumors, as useful as a retard with a law degree. And the work environment were becoming very unpleasant. It wasn't the sort of thing that you'd expect from a job. Well, that's unless you get paid to shit yourself all day. But it was when popular work in progress manager, 60-year-old Fred Biggs, fell to the canteen floor and started spraying shit out of his ass like a garden hose and died a day later in hospital. The laboratory was thrown into a state of panic. Graham was clearly shaken because he'd worked side by side with both of the dead men, and now he was starting to feel like he were cursed. He'd always enjoyed getting the two men a cup of tea when the tea lady was between shifts, and the tea cart was left out so the staff could help themselves. But besides the point of everyone dying around him in the laboratory, Graham was fitting into his job well, and the first couple of weeks he stayed with his married sister, but then moved into his own bedsit. After all, sickness, death, misery, it can bring people closer together. The English school system in the 60s, at best, could be described as harsh, at worst, draconian. Graham Young was a solitary and awkward child, and although he had an IQ that was off the charts, his interest in studies were limited, with only science and chemistry worth his effort and attention. There was a former science teacher who noted that Graham knew more about science than he did. When he was only 7 years old, he started checking medical books out of the library. And it was one day while looking for a wrench that his son borrowed, Fred found a large supply of medical bottles hidden in his son's closet. Questioned, Graham told his father he'd stolen them from behind the chemist in the garbage. By the time he was 14, even Graham's teachers admitted that he was an expert on medicines and poisons, but he was also exhibiting other qualities that some deemed less favorable.
I've been round to the house, and his wife, who is his stepmother, his late stepmother, she showed me photos of what he'd drawn of coffins with R.I.P. and death's head and all that kind of thing. She used to show, and she said, "What do you think of these kind of things?" So I said, "Well, your boy, isn't he?"
It was only weeks after his wife's death that Fred Young started to regularly fall ill, eventually going to the hospital for tests, where they returned to Mr. Young with the shocking discovery that he was really a woman. Nah, I'm just messing with you. He were poisoned. His system was full of antimony, a rare metallic substance that was deadly, and one more dose would have most certainly killed him. When Fred confronted his son about the possibility of his science kit accidentally contaminating the family food supply, Graham vehemently denied this and said that any practitioner of poison knows how to safeguard. Which to me right there, his answer is a validation of guilt. But with nothing to go on it, his father dropped it. And speaking of dropping it, by the fall of '71, the employees were still dropping like flies. And speaking of flies, they should have probably given up on cleaning the shit off the canteen floor and just turned it into a mud wrestling ring. Hire some good-looking lab assistants, bikinis, it could work out. Tainted water supply, improperly stored chemicals, everyone had a theory, but no one had an answer on what was so adversely affecting the company's employees. One of those employees that had fallen ill and ended up with one foot in the abyss worked at the same table as Graham and had fond memories of the cheerful young man regularly getting him a cup of tea.
At this time, I was getting this feeling that somebody had put on an old, the old dueling glove, the male glove, the metal glove, and they'd somehow got right inside my ribs, and they were grabbing hold of what was inside and just squeezing and twisting like that. And that's no word of a lie.
That's when you asked me for the gun, wasn't it?
Yeah, that
when
was...
he got to the point of asking for a gun to shoot himself, he was in that agony, yeah.
If you were my girlfriend, I'd ask for a gun as well, and I know where I'd aim it. But his symptoms just kept getting worse, that along with other employees, and his hair even started falling out. Employees who'd been there for years were now quitting, and any new ones that joined after they got ill after a week or two would leave. It was Graham's chemistry teacher who had become concerned by his students' interest in poison and its effect on the human body. And it was in his teacher's notes that he wrote the child may possibly be a genius, but he found that a worry on how these mental powers would be used. So he arranged for a psychiatrist to see the child while posing as a career counselor. Once with the undercover psychiatrist, Graham seemed delighted to brag about his prowess with poisons and what he could do with them and the effect they'd have on the human body. After the interview concluded, the disturbed psychiatrist contacted the authorities. And the next day, while Graham was at school, the police checked his room and they found enough poison to kill over 300 people, or a room full of lesbians, whatever came first. And when Graham came home that night, the police were waiting. When they opened his briefcase, it was like a goddamn science lab with more poisons than they thought existed, all in tiny vials ready to go. He told the cops that he loved the power of holding life over death, including trying to kill his own best friend who he'd left a leg mental.
He always had, or usually had, poison with him. He particularly carried a vial of either antimonine potassium tartrate or some other drug in his top left-hand pocket. Small vial, about so big. And he'd often take it out, look at it, refer to it as his little friend. Gradually, as he realised I could appreciate what he was doing, he began to tell me and to hint to me that he was poisoning people. His mother was sick, and this, that and the other. And over the period of time, it became, I knew that he was doing it, he knew that I did, and he didn't even try and hide it. He often used to discuss it and come in and tell me how ill his mother was, or what he was doing, or what poisons he was using. And towards the latter part, I remember he showed me a graph, and one axis of the graph was what he said was the state of her illness, and the other axis was when he was giving her doses of poison.
Well, I'm glad you went to the authorities about this, Chris. Enjoy being crippled. It was in July of 1962 that the 14-year-old pleaded guilty to trying to murder his best friend, father, and his sister, with no one realizing that he'd killed his own stepmother because she'd been cremated. And the court-appointed psychiatrist recommended he never be let out.
There is no doubt in my mind that this youth is at present a very serious danger to other people. His intense obsession and almost exclusive interest in drugs and their poisoning effects is not likely to change, and he could well repeat his cool, calm, calculating administration of these poisons at any time.
And it was fortunate that a judge agreed, decreeing that Graham Young should be held in a hospital for the criminally insane at Broadmoor for at least 15 years and not be released until a psychiatrist gave permission. And at only 14 and a half, he was the youngest prisoner ever to be held in a hospital for the criminally insane. And while serving his sentence with the other whack jobs, his family still visited him, not wanting to think that he'd been abandoned. But serving time didn't seem to curtail his passion for poison.
The only thing he used to say to me that he wanted matches, which at that time didn't ring a bell to me. But I presume that you can make poison out of matches, can't you?
In the asylum, Young gained a sinister reputation and guards and patients alike feared him, so much so that he was given his own wing in the hospital, restricted to limited social interaction. It was while serving his sentence, he was deemed dangerous enough to be given a personal psychiatrist who worked closely with the child, trying to prepare him for a day when he would one day be out in society again. He was even given a job in the staff canteen, but this was swiftly halted when only 2 days into his new role, drain cleaner was found in one of the nurses' coffee. And although there were a few hiccups, the treatments seemed to be working, and over the next few years, Graham became less fixated on poisoning and calmed down. And by 1970, they figured he was ready for release, with the stipulation he continued treatment. It was as he was leaving the front door of Broadmoor, he turned to one of his guards, and he said, "I'm now going to kill one person for every 1 year that I've been in here." Which you think the guard might have mentioned to someone. Once out of the insane asylum, he was sent to a government training center just outside of London, where they gave him a course on store management, and he received a glowing report and was certified as good to go, although that's probably the wrong word to use. But what wasn't mentioned, that while Graham Young was at that training center, several of the teachers and students fell extremely ill. Headaches, nausea, the shits, you know the score. But nevertheless, the report that the training center sent to Hadlin and Newhouse on Graham Young were glowing, like he was Jesus Christ coming back to Earth looking for a job. No hint he were a mental patient going around poisoning people.
This man has an above average intelligence. He is very conscientious in his work, able to work to instructions given to him, as well as on his own initiative.
But management did notice one thing, that their job applicant had received psychiatric help throughout his youth. So they asked for clarification on this.
They said that they would send me further information on Graham Young. And 3 days later, I received this letter. Dear Sir, in response to your request, I am forwarding a copy of Dr. Unwin's report on Mr. Young. I am sure you will find this satisfactory. The document attached to that letter was a medical certificate on Graham Frederick Young, which I'll read out, if I may. This man has suffered a deep-going personality disorder, which necessitated his hospitalization throughout the whole of his adolescence. He has, however, made an extremely full recovery and is now entirely fit for discharge, his sole disability now being the need to catch up on his lost time.
Young was offered the job and started work on the 10th of May 1971, but quickly brought attention to himself with his fascination for Hitler and all things morbid.
His general conversation was about macabre things, war, poisoners, and that kind of thing. It's pretty limited. Quite often he's good at taking off Hitler speeches. Actually, I don't know whether they're genuine Hitler speeches, but they're in English, obviously. And he did all the Hitler thing. The way the Hitler is supposed to do it, done all this.
It was at Hadlin's laboratory when a staff meeting was called by the company doctor to ensure the panicked employees that there was no evidence of radiation or other contaminants. That Young started asking questions about poisons, and he seemed to know just a little too much for the doctor's comfort. But it was when he asked about heavy metal poisoning, or to be more specific, a poison called thallium, that the doctor told management, and they alerted the police. It was then that Scotland Yard started poking around to see if anybody in the lab had a criminal past. It was by chance that the officer who'd been called by Hadlin's laboratories was at a lunch with a bunch of forensic scientists, and he was describing the symptoms that the staff in the lab had been experiencing, and they were unanimous that it was thallium poisoning. And this is when he discovered that employee Graham Young had recently been released from Broadmoor, a hospital for the criminally insane, where he'd just spent 9 years for poisoning his family. It was then that police raced to Graham Young's bedsit, but he wasn't there, so they went to his sister's, still no sign of the poisoner. He was later arrested at his father's house, and when they took him in, they said he was as arrogant as ever. Didn't even seem worried, admitting to the whole goddamn thing, but he stopped short of putting his signature to his confession. When they searched Young's bedsit, there was enough poison to kill Jabba the Hutt, and they discovered that he had been forging supply documents from the laboratory, pretending to be a medical researcher and getting the poisons from local chemists. And Hadlin and Newhouse were furious that Young's background had been concealed from them.
Had I known of Graham Young's background and subsequently employed him, then as soon as anyone was ill, particularly anyone working closely with him, I could have taken the appropriate action to see that this was investigated. As it was, Robert Eagle was ill for 5 weeks before he was finally taken ill at the time which resulted in his death. Not only his life could have been saved, of course, but the second death would never have occurred, and the other people associated with this business who've experienced extreme suffering would have been protected from that.
It was then the police exhumed the remains of who they felt were Graham Young's 2 victims and found that they'd both died of thallium poisoning. And this was essential if they wanted to lock him up, because under British law, they were unable to bring up his past as a teenage poisoner or his extended stay in a hospital for the criminally insane. And although all the police had was circumstantial evidence, it was a diary that Graham Young kept that was the most damning when establishing his guilt, going into precise detail on how the poison affected each of his victims and how to tweak the recipe. And when the papers found out that Young had been a teenage poisoner and then released to kill again, the public went nuttier than a room of retards being told that Jello time had been cancelled. And after that, laws were changed forever to protect the British public. And from that day on, Graham Young's name was forged in history as Britain's worst poisoner, and certainly made everyone think twice when offered a cup of tea.